Welcome back. All right, so looking through the channel's video history, it doesn't seem like I've had the debate lately about whether or not the NHL should expand. So, whether or not it's going to doesn't seem to be much in debate. That there's going to be an expansion. Likely, we see 36 teams. We see 4 extra teams added. I think 2030 is when we start seeing them. But could it happen sooner? Sure. Do I think it's going to? Probably not, but it could. I think the NHL will do the due diligence. And I think they'll find 4 markets. There will be debates between now and then on which 4 markets they should be. And that's not really what this video is, so I don't have the teams up there because I've had that debate recently. But the question isn't necessarily the whether or not they will, it's the whether or not they should. So I've added 7 arguments in the for, 7 arguments in the against. And so we'll go ahead and discuss this. Now, I'm fine with them expanding, and I think that expansion, for all of the arguments against expansion that I've seen, and I've seen plenty of them on this channel over the last week especially, I still think expansion is going to happen. And I think it is to the benefit of the league. But I want to go through each point on the board. The first one under the for is it adds new markets. You have new markets where there's going to be interest. Now, obviously, the NHL has to do due diligence to see what level of interest there is. You don't want to put them in one location and have them move 2 years later. You don't want to end up in that situation. We went through that in the 70s, right? So you don't want to be in a situation where you're putting them in a market where it's not going to work. But adding new markets, as long as you're going to the right ones, and this is where the debate comes in of where the right ones are. But I'm just saying if the NHL does their due diligence, and maybe switches to the old logo while we're at it, because I like the old logo better. But adding new markets, I think, is good. I do. I think if they're the right markets. And I will come back to that. Now, the argument against, part of it is 32 teams are perfect. I agree. I think having 16 teams above the playoff line, 16 teams below is perfect. When I hear people talking about expanding the playoffs, I kind of roll my eyes and say to myself, no, 16 teams is perfect. You do not need to expand the playoffs. Expanding the playoffs waters down said playoffs. I don't have a problem with having more teams in the league in general. I think the playoffs should be difficult to reach. And I think that's the difference is back when I was a kid, there were 16 teams out of 21 that made the playoffs. Making the playoffs was considered to be not easy, but kind of expected in most locales. And it's not as expected now. There are good teams that miss the playoffs. I think that's to the benefit of all of us as fans and makes for some exciting games down the stretch, which back in the day wasn't necessarily the case. You might have a team that's 15 games below 500 and they get in the playoffs because only one team in their division didn't make the playoffs. So I do think from that perspective, the 32-team argument is there, but we'll see. I know the NHL's expansion is going to happen. I am concerned they'll expand the playoffs as well if they go to 36 teams. I do have that concern. Now, in the for, I have new chances for fringe players. Look at Michael Carcone in Arizona. If you don't add Vegas and Seattle, there's no guarantee that Carcone isn't currently playing well for Arizona, but there's that chance, right? Because now you've taken 40 jobs out, and maybe a guy like Carcone doesn't get a chance. Maybe Phil DiGiuseppe doesn't get a chance in Vancouver to start the year in Vancouver. And I've seen the argument about whether or not some of these players in the AHL, well, they're not quite NHL caliber. I remember in previous generations there were players in the AHL that were quite good, just couldn't get a break in the NHL. They just couldn't find a team. And more teams you add, the more of those players you're actually going to see get a chance to play in the National Hockey League. But with the new fringe players, and I tried to make sure that the one on the left kind of goes with the one on the right. In this case, waters down the product, which is an argument I've seen. It waters it all down. That's an argument that goes back to when the San Jose Sharks come into the NHL. It's not something the NHL's ever shown any concern with. It's not something that's prevented them from expanding before. We went from 21 teams to 30 in less than a decade. So when I see people talking about, it's so watered down. Yeah, they went from 30 to 32. It's not watered down. Not in my eyes, anyways. I think going from 21 to 30, you can make that argument. You can make the argument by the time Minnesota and Columbus came in, they had to get kind of creative because they were picking through what had already been picked through a year or two earlier by Atlanta. And Atlanta did a poor job because they didn't really have much to pick from either. So definitely we saw some watering down, I think, in the 90s. I'm not as worried about it here. Going from 32 to 36, again, over a period where it's going to be staggered teams coming in, not all 4 over a period of 2 years, which, again, we've seen. Ottawa and Tampa came in, and then a year later it was Florida and Anaheim. So that's happened in the NHL before. They have expanded that quickly. They've been far more deliberate this time around. Money. Money's in the four because money. You get your expansion fee, which could be as high as $1 billion next time out, right? And then afterwards, you build strong markets. Seattle and Vegas have been cash positive. Now, I've seen the argument of, well, Vegas, a lot of it's tourists. It's not. I've been there. A lot of their, especially the season ticket base, these are locals who don't go to the Strip very often at all. Vegas locals do not like the Strip. Avoid it at all costs. But they will come in and they will brave the Strip to go in and watch Vegas Golden Knights games. And I think there's enough of a fan base there from the locals to keep things afloat even when things aren't fantastic. Yes, it's easier to sell out tickets when you've got a defending Stanley Cup champion in your building, but I think there's enough fans in Vegas to keep things afloat for when things do get lean there. And they will. At some point in time they will. But they've still been cash flow positive. Same with Seattle. So they've been a net benefit to the league. Plus, we'll get into Vegas again in a moment here, but I want to come over to this side. The argument against seems to be they didn't put a team where I wanted it. And this was something we saw when Vegas got named. Vegas got named. How dare they screw over Quebec City like that? I talked about Quebec City yesterday. Clearly Las Vegas, there were some concerns about what the gambling might do. Yep. I don't know that there's any direct correlation between Vegas coming into the NHL and the fact that there's gambling ads everywhere, but it feels like there's been a change in sports towards gambling advertising. And there's definitely some arguments to be made about where the NHL picks as opposed to where they could go. But again, they have a pretty good track record. Everybody will mention Arizona. I know that. But the NHL in general, where they've gone, they have a pretty good track record. Where either the market works now, or it has had issues in the past, and it's working better. It has, and Florida's gotten better over the last few years. Carolina, as I've mentioned in recent videos as well, has become a much better franchise with new ownership. And yeah, so the argument that they're going to put a team where you don't want it, yeah, that's probably the case. That is usually the case. If a team goes to Salt Lake City, there will be those who are kind of sad in Houston because it looked like Houston was going to be the next city. And if a team moves to Houston, there'll be people in Salt Lake City saying, why didn't we get that next team? We should have had that next team. So that's always going to be an argument. Now, coming back over to the four, got into Vegas before other leagues. I think it was important that the NHL got into Las Vegas when they did. They got that fan base before you get baseball, football, and everything else in there. Before F1 decided to screw up the Strip to put in their track, they got in there. And it feels like on some level it's possible with some of the rumored locations. The NHL might be able to recreate that a little bit. So if they're smart, if they get into maybe a suburb area rather than being in a main downtown area, put a team where other teams aren't necessarily. I'm wearing Cleveland just because I'd love to see a team back in Cleveland. I know that's not going to happen, but I'd love to see it. Just the Battle of Ohio, Cleveland, Columbus. Let's do it. But yeah, so on some level, if they could replicate something like that and just be smart and proactive, getting into Las Vegas was brilliant on their behalf because they got those fans, they bonded to the fans in that first year, and that bond continues to this day. One argument against, it does make the cup chase more difficult. So Vegas wins the Stanley Cup. Well, Vegas wasn't even in the league up until 2017. So before that, was it easier to win a Stanley Cup? Well, yeah. So I've talked about how getting into the playoffs was easier in the 80s. You can make the argument that it wasn't necessarily easier to win a Stanley Cup, but since it's easier to make the playoffs, there were more teams who might have had a realistic vision of, so we could win a Stanley Cup if we get hot at the right time. So you'd have maybe 8 out of 21 teams that felt like maybe if things fell their way, whereas now you might have 8 teams out of 32. So now it feels like it's a lot more difficult because it kind of is, right? It does make things more difficult just because the general proportion of teams that could go for a Stanley Cup is lower than what it was 30, 40 years ago. But I'm old enough to remember all that, and the teams that were at the bottom usually weren't all that good. And so the first round of the playoffs could kind of be somewhat boring depending on the series you were watching. Not that often, though. There'd usually be some fighting and stuff going on back in the 80s. So let's get back to the four. Driving up the salary cap. So I've talked about cash flow positive. This drives up the salary cap. People have complained about the flat cap. I've talked about the flat cap in videos for years. I think people just have a negative bias towards the NHL and anything financial, but the salary cap should start going up this summer substantially, and adding teams will drive that up as well, right? You are creating more jobs as well. So the salary cap goes up, there's more jobs, the NHLPA is happy. This is where when people say there should be contraction, not too sure the NHLPA is going to like the idea of, say, contract by 4 teams. That's about 100 guys out of work. I don't know the NHLPA is going to be all that happy with that idea. So the salary cap would go up with extra teams in the league. Again, as long as they're cash flow positive. But against is the fact that, are there too many rebuilds? I don't know why I said rebuilds like that. No idea, but I'll just truck through it. Nobody will even notice. But there are a lot of rebuilds. The one thing that I've noticed is that there's some teams that tear everything down, right down to the bone, and there's some that don't, that go into the rebuild and they move out certain pieces of the team without losing that heart. Right now, there's a lot of talk about Calgary. I kind of feel like Calgary's going to do that. They're going to move out some guys, but they're not going to give up on next year, and they're not going to make it so they're in this forever rebuild situation that some teams find themselves in. Buffalo, how long have they been down? Ottawa, how long have they been down? Digging your way out of a rebuild is really, really difficult, and there are a lot of rebuilds. And if you add teams, you get up to 36 teams, you're potentially adding, I would estimate, 2 or 3 more teams that might look at a playoff chase and go, well, we're nowhere near, and go into some form of a rebuild as a response. So the other thing, too, is that if too many teams end up in rebuilds, we may see a rebuild kind of seen as the last option rather than one of the first. It just feels like there's a lot of calls from fans around the league. This team should rebuild. This team should rebuild. This team, it's like they can't all rebuild at the same time. That's just not how it works. But that is a concern. Now, one thing to look at, and this again is on the money side, and a lot of the positives are going to be money side, is more markets should raise broadcasting rights fees. So the regional broadcasting of sports is going the way of the dodo, right? Bally Sports, just one of many that have had the bankruptcy, and just it doesn't look like it works. The regional sports not being the cash cow everybody thought it would be. But it should still raise broadcasting fees or delay the drop of broadcasting fees if you add more markets. So for ESPN, if you've got 4 more American markets, you got more that you can market. You've got more fans you can get to watch them, right? If you get 3 American and 1 Canadian team, well then for the Canadian rights, you now got 8 Canadian teams out of, again, it's a league of 36 teams, but if you had 8 Canadian teams, nice even number there, your Hockey Day in Canada, it's 4 matchups between Canadian teams, might help broadcasting rights fees that way as well. Now, the one thing, again, coming back over to the negative, is the viability, an issue with certain markets. And I will agree with people that before you expand, you have to make sure that all of your markets are in good shape. One of the arguments I've had against the way Major League Soccer's done it, MLS has been very aggressive in their expansion. I'm not too sure that all of these markets are going to succeed. I'm not too sure that they haven't expanded far too quickly into too many markets, but we'll see, right? Maybe MLS is going to look really genius for it. I don't see MLS as a direct competitor to the NHL either. I mean, on some level, sure, but how much of a crossover there is between soccer/football fans, for those in Europe, and hockey, I'm not too sure on that. I don't know that MLS necessarily hurts the NHL with their rise to prominence. I don't think the Whitecaps have had any effect on the Canucks, for instance. There are Whitecaps fans, there are Canuck fans. I don't know how much crossover we see, but viability is something to be discussed, and the fact that the NHL has at times expanded while they've had franchises going through difficulties. Looking back to the 70s again, you have all this expansion, then you have Cleveland go under and you contract there, and then you expand again a couple years later by bringing in WHA teams. It felt like it was very much fly by the seat of your pants kind of way of running things. It doesn't work that way. So is there an argument to be made that you have to fix all of your roster, all of your teams, not rosters, but all of your teams in terms of their financial state before you consider expanding? I would say yes. I will agree with that criticism. And I do think they want to do that. I think that's why the Arizona question is as prominent as it is, because before they go into expansion mode, they want to know what's going to happen with that franchise first, whether you get the building or whether you don't, and whether you move or whether you don't, right? Now, 4, and this is something NHL likes. They love having their 16 game days. Love it. They do. They had 2 of them this year. I expect next year we'll see, I would say 4. I'm going to conservatively say we'll see 4 days next year where it's 16 games. Half of them, I would think, of the 4 I'm predicting, 2 of them will be on, one on a Tuesday and one on a Thursday. And it'll be the overlapping game every 15 minutes. And if you add more teams, you can now have a 17 game day. You can have an 18 game day. And at some point in time, I just tap out and say, I did as much as I could, because then we're into like, me needing 5 boards potentially for review. If we're having overlapping games. But the NHL likes to set records. They wanted to set a record for the longest continuous time that their sport was being broadcast on TV. They didn't quite get that this year, but are they going to continue? Probably. So one benefit of expanding to 36 teams is the NHL could say, hey, we got 18 games on tonight. Those other leagues have maybe 14, 15, amateurs. We do 18 games in a night. And then we would see more days of 16 games, days of 17 games. I think the lopsided schedule is here to stay, and I think they would use that as a marketing tool. So you add 4 more markets, you're adding more, eyeballs to the product, and then you're saying, all right, we're going to put all 36 teams on at the same time. Let's go. Same day, not at the same time. Although maybe at some point we'll have 18 games and they all start at 7 o'clock Eastern. All of them. Just sure, why not? Sure. I wouldn't be all that surprised, honestly, kidding aside. But one argument against is that you go to those 36 teams, you go with that expansion of 4 teams, you are draining talent from established teams. And I can't argue that you're not. I can't argue that if you add 4 players from every team to get to 36 teams, 1 player from each team, and then you have 4 teams, so that's a pretty healthy number altogether. You are draining the talent pool for some of these squads. You're not getting the best guys, but you're getting some pretty good players. I would think that the teams 33 through 36 will get the same expansion rules as Vegas and Seattle did. They'd be pretty competitive right out of the gate. And there would be some teams that get hurt, especially if the NHL did decide we're going to go from 32 to 36 in 3 years. Let's just say that they add 2 teams one year, a third the next year, and a fourth the next year. You would definitely have some teams that would shed some talent. The other side of that, though, and it's not on the positive, is when these expansion teams come in, it's a chance for you to dump off a bad contract if you're an established team. It's a chance for you to potentially reset things a little bit from a salary cap perspective. So I don't think it's all necessarily doom and gloom when it comes to the draining the talent from established teams, because some of that could be a bad contract, which would then allow that to GM to go out and sign a new bad contract on July the 1st and say, hey, look, I got a new bad contract after I traded the last bad contract. And I just got a 3-year extension, so you're stuck with me. That kind of GM talk that we love in July. But I understand both arguments. Really, honestly, for me, one thing that I really decided early on with the channel is that while my opinion is I think 32 teams is perfect. You could leave it at 32 teams. I understand the league wants to expand, and it's most likely going to happen. So I'm kind of the mind that I'm accepting it. I'm all right with it. We'll see which locations they pick. But I do understand the negatives behind it as well. I don't get behind the idea, though, there isn't enough premier talent in the hockey world to make up 40 more players on 2 more rosters, or even 80 players on 4 more rosters. There are some very talented players that are not in the National Hockey League. There are players who can't play in the NHL because the team that has their rights knows they need to be a top 6 forward. They do not have a top 6 spot for them. And they know that their game does not translate to bottom 6 minutes. They don't play a 3rd or 4th line role well. So those players, when you get new teams in the league, may get a chance at a top 6 spot where they could excel with a brand new squad. And that ideally is what should happen. And it's something we saw happen back in the 90s when that expansion just blew right up. And you saw guys come in that we didn't know who they were in October, but we sure knew who they were by Christmas. And they ended up being pretty good players. Not, megastar, superstar like a Crosby or a McDavid or anything, but you definitely had some good players come into the league, and it definitely softened my stance, because I thought as well, going from 21 to 30, I thought, man, I don't know if there's going to be enough good players. Because before that expansion into San Jose, even, there were players in the NHL that you could debate whether or not they should be in the NHL. But I didn't notice a huge drop off in talent. It does drive up scoring as well when you get expansion, especially if it's that fast. So, yeah, and we saw scoring go up when Seattle and Vegas came in. Scoring's down a little bit this year from where it was last year, and maybe that's partially it. Maybe part of it is that expansion things have settled down. You go to 36 teams, scoring's going to go up again. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below regarding this topic. I wanted to have this discussion today. I thought, sure, it's a Friday afternoon. Why not have this discussion? Because I do get the feeling that the fact that we keep hearing they're not in expansion mode right now means they're going to be. So, yeah. As the example I've always used is if somebody asked me, oh, is this your wife, Yvonne? If I said, yeah, she's my wife. I'm not in divorce mode right now. I'm not considering a new wife. She's my wife, right? Yeah, she's my wife at this point. Yep. You'd have some questions. So when the commissioner's saying we're not in expansion mode right now, they're going to go into expansion mode. So there you go. But thank you guys for all your support as always. Do hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon. And find the stop button. And now I did. All right. I will talk to you again soon.